I'm really excited about the slide I'm showing you here because it's my picture coming out of a printer, and this was a billboard in Los Angeles this was years ago, but I was real excited to have that. So it's a great honor in my career to be an explorer of light with Canon. And one of the things that's happening today is like prints are coming back into existence. Of course, the digital media, online images, they're not going away at all. But printing is getting a lot more influenced in our lives. As a matter of fact, having prints is something we can frame. It reminds us of experiences we've had, life's experiences. So every day in my home, I've got hundreds of pictures all over my home. And every time I walk by one and see one, I may not look at it and see it, but there's an influence in my home of love or happiness or something monumental in my life. Some of us sell images, so printing, of course, is important for that too. But today, we're going to look at printing, experience printmaking, using something called Print Studio Pro. Print Studio Pro is a free software, and it's from Canon. It's designed for Canon printers, and the DMAX on that is fantastic, by the way. And it's free. You download it from the internet, from the Canon website for your printer, for your Canon printer, and you use that opposed to using the print module from Photoshop, from Lightroom, or from DPP, or whatever you might use. Well, those are the three programs that we use Print Studio Pro from. And it's a wonderful interface. It's kind of like a RIP. What it does, it allows you to set up a series of different functions so you're instantly getting great prints. Come on in. As a matter of fact, this is the Canon Image Prograph 1000. It's a brand new printer. It's brand new on the market. And Nick is here with me today from Canon.
Hi, everyone.
And every now and then I'm going to throw a question at him to answer technically with the printers. I have the Image Prograph 6400, the 8300. I have the Pixma Pro 1 and a bunch of scan all-in-one printers from Canon. And the one thing I enjoy as a professional is getting the print right the first time without having to go back and reprint and reprint and reprint. I started in color management back in the 90s. About over 20 years ago, I became a color management expert creating profiles for print houses and what little printers we had back then, which were a Kodak printer, and then came Epson finally with the first inkjet printer. But around 2000, I was basically going to every lab, photographic lab in America, helping them make a transition from film to digital with us photographers and color management wise. So when I print today, and I'm excited to tell you that I've never used this printer until today. And this printer actually came off the display floor. And all of these images that we passed around earlier and that you'll see come out today are tack right on color, right on density. They're beautiful. Exactly what I demand out of a printer is what this printer is doing. And I knew that it would. So I came up here knowing I was going to have great success with this printer right away. And when you see how easy it is to get great results, you're going to fall in love with Print Studio Pro and the Canon printers. So let's talk about the workflow, a digital workflow altogether. there's basically three zones. There's the input part, the process and output part. And there's a couple of things that we have to mandate when it comes to controlling your color, getting the best possible color and tone you can. But those things are only two little things that we have to be responsible for. So let's take a closer look. From the camera, if you're shooting JPEG, the camera is doing two things. It has a processor, or the Canon cameras have maybe two processors in the camera that will process your image for you if you're shooting JPEG. And the other thing that happens in camera is if you're shooting JPEG, it embeds a color space. And that color space is either going to be sRGB or ProPhoto RGB. There's nothing wrong with any of that except for one thing, and that is when you get into the process, you're working with a locked amount of information. And again, that's okay, but you're kind of locked in. So you're going from camera with a JPEG inside of a color space. If you're shooting RAW, the RAW processing a color space doesn't really happen until you're in process. As a matter of fact, with the RAW, you're in an abyss of color, if you will. And until you get into a processor such as Lightroom or Photoshop or DPP, that's when you are utilizing a color space. But the wonderful thing about shooting RAW with that color space is you have chrominance data outside that color space that you can pull into that color space to use. That's the most magnificent thing about shooting RAW. So if you want that opportunity to pull in more data into your imagery, then RAW is the way to go. So this is not a RAW or JPEG function, but the fact is the camera processes the image for you. If you go to the process yourself, then you have the ability to process and mandate the color space. The other thing is your monitor, your display that you're using. Your display has a color space also. That's nothing that you use. You don't use the color space of the monitor. The monitor color space is something that uses you, if you will, because once you calibrate your monitor, then the color and tonal data that you see on your display, before you see it, goes through your monitor calibrated color space to emulate as close as possible what you're looking at with what ability your monitor has to show you that information. Does that make sense? Because it sure sounded complicated to me. Okay. So we're working with the color space in our file, and we're viewing that on our monitor through a color space of a calibrated monitor. When we're ready to go to print, then we take the color space that we're working in our computer and convert that to the color space of whatever printer we go to. And here I have 4 different examples of spaces that we might go to. The printer we're working with today, and I'll show you how easy it is to convert to that. If you use a professional lab, they need to convert the color space you're working in to their printer color space, and you know what? They do that. You don't have to do that. But you may have to conform the color space of the file that you're working in. You may have to change that to send to them. That's up to each lab. And then there's the internet. Now, how many of you have ever put images on the internet and you looked at it and said, ouch, that's not my color? Has that ever happened to you? And there's only one reason that happened, and that's because the color space was not in sRGB. So if your image is going to go to the internet, convert it to sRGB, and then you will have matching color on your screen. Your blue sky will not be purple. And finally, there's the printing press, like going to the newspaper or a magazine. That's also a conversion, but it's also a different animal when you come to controlling your color. It's not defined by the sensor so much, it's defined by the menu on the back of the camera, what you tell it, the default is usually sRGB, and then the other option that you can choose is Adobe RGB. But I don't know any reason today, in today's workflow, to choose Adobe RGB, while sRGB works perfectly well in the workflow today. Adobe RGB is a larger gamut. I'll go into that just a little bit in a few minutes. But you are correct. The camera is a setting that you actually can change. But the camera decides what color space that's going to be workable in that file. So once you lock in a color space, you can change the color of it, but you can't do that by virtue of maintaining a high level of pixel integrity. You have to change that integrity to change the color, and that's why with a raw file, you can just move this in and it's still the same resolution, if you will. We're going to talk about what we need to calibrate. And there are two things that we need to pay attention to in the camera. What are those two things? You know them. One of them is
whether you're using raw space or JPEG, and ISO and Lightroom.
okay, very good. How you calibrate a camera, good answer, thank you for that.
Oh, sorry, calibrated.
I probably didn't ask it properly, that's perfectly fine, but your answer was very good, thank you. How you calibrate a camera is white balancing, yes, thank you. That's how we calibrate a camera. But there are two issues that we have to become really, really good at, and white balance is one of those things. And what's the other thing that we have to really be good at to get good information in our files? Exposure, the correct exposure. So whatever f-stop and shutter speed, whatever. So that's our responsibility. If you give me a file that's got a good white balance to it and a good exposure, there's no limitation when it comes to the output at all. No limitation. The quality, the color, the brilliance, the density. It's when we have trouble with those two things, that's where we run into trouble at the end here too. So this is our biggest responsibility using cameras, is getting good white balance and a good exposure. Now on the camera, there's something called a matrix setup. In the Canon cameras, it's a picture style. And if you're shooting JPEG, then you certainly want to possibly use one of those to change the look of your images. Personally, I shoot raw, and I don't use a matrix setup at all. I just shoot native in camera. I'm a native camera shooter. Oh, a monitor calibration. That's one more responsibility that we have to endure. We have to calibrate our monitors. There are no monitors that come out of a box that's already calibrated. It doesn't happen that way. So we have to calibrate it. You can calibrate using a device like you see here, or you can actually go into your system, whether it's a PC or a Macintosh, and there's a means inside the system to emulate calibration there. If you have nothing else, do that. But I highly recommend a calibration device. Why? Because a calibration device knows the colors. And actually what happens when you calibrate using a device such as this, there's two things that happen. You set a white point, which is like white balancing, and there's a luminance, which is kind of like a contrast ratio. But the other thing in the computer is something called a working color space. And now, if we're shooting JPEG, that working color space is embedded in the file. It's already there. If you're working in Lightroom with RAW file, you're automatically working in something called ProPhoto RGB, which is the largest color space that we basically use today. If you're working in Photoshop from RAW files, you're automatically, and you're going through Adobe Camera Raw, you're automatically working in sRGB if you didn't know that, and you have to go set that up differently if you want to change that. And I'll show you that if you'd like later, but we are going to be working out of Lightroom today. Yes, sir.
What does DPP use?
DPP uses sRGB as a default, but it's easy to change that to wide gamut. Instead of ProPhoto RGB, it uses wide gamut. Same difference. Think about this with me. We have a display. A display is quite limited in what its capabilities are showing us. And it's only showing us two things. It's showing us chrominance data, which is color, and luminance data, which is brightness and contrast. And some monitors are very limited in that aspect, and other monitors are aged in that aspect, and its ability to show that chrominance and luminance data is very weak. So even calibrating that kind of data, it's limited in what it can show you. Are you with me on that? So now we're at the mercy of what our monitor will show us, and there's no guide to that. So the labs in the turn of the digital century, which is the year 2000, the labs would send us something called a Shirley. And they would say, hold this up to your monitor and adjust your monitor until it looks like this, and save that Adobe Gamma panel. And if you use a different lab, you have to do that for them. And you talk about a mess. A pure mess. So in the meantime, you're racking your monitor phosphors out of control. And anyway, I don't need to spend much time on that. A brilliant question. So there is no real guide to a monitor. It depends on what kind of monitor you have, number one, how old it is, and the method you use to calibrate it with. So understand this part. Experience is the best teacher. So what you see on your display and how it reacts to printing is something we have to learn through experience. And what element are we looking for with that in mind? Consistency. If we're consistent from what we're seeing and what we're getting, if there is consistency there, even if it's off someplace, it's consistency we're looking for. So if we have an inadequate display and it's coming out green, then we know that we need to change something somewhere. And in my mind, that would be a new monitor. But really good question, and that's an important information for all of us to consider. A working color space. When you calibrate your monitor, it reads all these series of color patches, and it creates something called a system profile. It's in your system. It's not in Photoshop or Lightroom. It's in your system. Okay, and here's an example of just what I mentioned. So the sensor is going to read a series of different colors. It's going to generate an ICC profile. All those colors that the sensor reads, it knows what those colors are supposed to look like. When it reads the values coming off your screen, it creates a profile that will filter the best it can what color it is and how you see that color now. And it goes into the profile, and that's deep into the system of your computer. I'm going to show you the same graphic in two different scenarios. But this is the color space of the file that you're working in. And that's the color space of the monitor you're working on. So your monitor probably isn't going to show you the entire color gamut. It's going to be close. If you've calibrated your monitor, it's going to be close enough. In a lot of cases, it's so close that the eye can't disseminate the difference. And this illustration is basically showing you the differences between our visual color gamut that we see and sRGB, ProPhoto RGB, and Adobe RGB, which are the three common color spaces that we utilize in our files today. You're all with me on this? You might lose a color gamut, but listen to me carefully. I'm going to explain something very quickly about that, because this is really important too. You're working in RAW, there is no color space. It goes into the camera. And now you're working in ProPhoto RGB, the largest color space. And as you process your image, as you change the color and the density and the contrast and the creative, whatever you're doing to it, when you change that, you're manipulating the raw file. You're manipulating this much information. And When you tell it to go to sRGB, the small color space, it goes to that very comfortably. So you don't really visually lose anything. If you start out in sRGB and you do all those things to it, then you're spreading that information out and you're removing it, basically. We used to call it removing pixel data. So you're weakening the file. If you want to know the truth of that, you watch the histogram. The histogram knows the truth. And we don't need to get that deeply into it, but that's a really good question, and I hope you followed me with that answer because it's a really important answer. Good, thank you.
So raw is always the maximum color space.
If you want to get the maximum amount of information, and we're talking not only color, we're also talking tonal values.
Right.
And think of it this way. An sRGB file from the camera, a JPEG file, has the ability to show you 256 brightness levels. A RAW file, because it is 14 bits from the camera or 16 bit in process, has the ability to process over 65,000 values, and we're talking per channel, red, green, or blue. So the ability to adjust that type of tonal information and get delicate transitions from the highlight to the shadow is pretty fantastic. Is good? I would recommend a monitor that has a high density contrast ratio, 1,000 to 1 at least. So whether it's Dell, Apple, ISO, whatever, make sure it's 1,000 to 1 ratio. The color data is going to be there. Getting your color right on any monitor is pretty easy. Getting that contrast ratio is the big difference. And by the way, so you have a 30-inch screen here, and you have your laptop, and you're both calibrated. The color is going to look the same. What's going to look different is the detail and the shadow and the highlights. You'll have much better detail and highlights on the larger screen. So how do you calibrate a printer? You don't have to these days. They're self-calibrating, but two things happen. A print head alignment and something called nozzle cleaning. But the one responsibility you have, and here's your responsibilities so far: white balance and good exposure. Decide on what color space you want to work on in the print and process. And if you have your own printer, your responsibility is to leave your printer turned on. Don't turn it off. Leave your printer turned on. There are how many bazillion nozzles in here?
It was 1536 per channel, so it's like 32,256,000.
Okay, if you can wrap your head around that, there's a lot of nozzles
There's a lot.
in these printers. So what happens when you turn your printer off and it's got ink coming through the nozzles, it's like, oh, it just sits there. Oh, okay, I'm sitting there. You're not using me, so I'm going to dry up. So you turn your printer back on, it has to regenerate itself, and it uses different nozzles, and that's a good thing. That's what it's all about. But if you keep it turned on, every now and then the printer will wake up. And I don't know if you have to go to the menu to tell it to do that, like you do on the image prograph printers now. But if you, every now and then you'll hear your printer wake up, it'll go through a little, what it's doing is it's running ink through the lines, keeping it clean and fluid. Yes, sir. If I'm out of town for a week and get home, the first thing I do is I print something. I don't care what it is. I just want to get something, ink going through that printer. So once a week for sure. But the more you print, and I haven't, knock on wood, I haven't had any issues. I've had to replace a head in 2 different printers once, but I haven't had any issues of, outside of that. And that was after a lot of printing abuse, if you will.
But
Yeah.
it won't actually stay on. These printers will actually shut off after a certain period of time.
Okay,
The
so-
IPFs will stay on though.
Well, on the IPF printers, you have to go into the advanced menu item and tell it not to turn itself off.
Right.
Is that option on this printer?
No, it's not.
You can't take
Sorry.
a long trip.
All right, so
But I mean, to Eddie's point, I mean, I've I print in the office all the time, and sometimes I go months without printing, and I'll fire it up, and it'll work just fine. We've built our printers to do that, you know.
So if you were doing that though, would then you go through this whole printer head alignment before you tried to print? You know, let's say it was off for quite a while. You know, all nozzle cleaning and all that. Would you do that before you actually tried to make a print?
When you turn it back on, it'll go through that process automatically
Oh,
by
it
itself.
does. Okay.
Yeah, it'll prompt you to do something.
Yes, sir.
The printer going to sleep and turning it off, is that two separate things or is that the same?
Well, this printer turns itself off. So my printers, I have to go turn them off. So I've got my image Prograph 6300, 8300, and my Pixma Pro 1 set so it does not go off. It stays on all the time. Now, if the electricity goes off, it turns them off. Okay, color space relations. This is the color space of your file. This is Pro Photo RGB, the same illustration I had earlier. And this is a lane color space of a small gamut of printer. Now the gamut of printers, these are much bigger, but it's the same thing. So what gives us great color like I've got here? How does this work? How can I be sure that this color is going to be the same that I'm looking at on my screen? If the color gamut of my image file is bigger than the color gamut of this printer, how does that work? It all has to do with something called an ICC profile. So when I go from my process, which is Pro Photo RGB, it's going to convert to the ink and media type to the printer. And it says, oh, I know what you want there. There's two settings that we're going to look at. They're called rendering intents. And one is called relative color metric. And these yellow dots represent the color that's in gamut in the printer. And the red dots represent the colors that are out of gamut. So when we convert using the relative color metric, these kind of move in on top of the other colors, kind of in the neighborhood, and they commingle together, creating pardon me, a more accurate rendition of the color. But it's a little bit, I might say, saturated. The rendering intent of perceptual, when those colors move in from out of gamut, they kind of move everything over and say, well, I'm taking over this space. This actually creates a bit more accuracy of color. So they're both good. My primary choice is relative color metric. If I'm doing a commercial assignment, I might use perceptual. I put this in here where your color space, your profiles go. If you go to a third-party company and get paper and go to their website and download the profile, this is just kind of a directory of where those go to. I'm not going to spend any time on that because I do want to move on. But in summary, what we've just talked about is from the camera, your white balance and exposure, your matrix setup, all of that influences how you shoot, or it should now. Because your responsibility is what? To get a good exposure, to get a good white balance. So that's what we want to do. It influences now how we shoot. The process, your monitor calibration, and the color space that you're going to utilize. And that's up to you entirely. That influences you, how you process your images. And then finally, printing. The two responsibilities that you need to be aware of is media type, whether it's matte, glossy, luster, and the printer profile, and we're going to get into that when we get into the print process in just a few minutes. And that is always the conclusion of your work. So, as a professional, as somebody that's been a photographer since 1960-something, experience is the best teacher. And it's experience. In a lot of cases, when I'm shooting a picture, I visualize that print. I visualize the end of that spectral, and that's a wonderful thing. Okay. Histogram. This is just a basic illustration. There's actually 5 zones, but I'm going to just go over 3. This is your highlight region, your mid-tone gamma region, and your shadow region on a histogram. And here's something that's called, I call the toe to the mountain. When the toe to the mountain hits the bottom, from that point to the edge, there's no information there. What's important to know about that is this happens to be a very healthy, beautiful looking histogram. The toe to the mountain. Here is an illustration of a histogram where the shadow is banked up against the left wall and it's climbing the wall. What does that tell us?
They're blocked.
That we're blocked up. We have no detail in some part of that image. And is that important? That's important to us to know, because why is that important? Well, there's no definition there, and I'm going to step out on a plank here and say sometimes we just don't care.
Sure.
Sometimes there's no detail and we just don't care. And point an example. You think that black was climbing up the wall? You bet it was. But I have to tell you, if you look at the quality of that black, it's beautiful. It's what we call a D-Max. It's a beautiful D-Max. So this printer just handles that D-Max so beautifully. It's just very exciting.
Yeah.
And you give me a good D-Max, and you got a really happy Max, because that's my real name is Max. Bada bing, bada boom. So the toe's climbing the wall. So I use DPP, Digital Photo Professional. That's Canon's proprietary image processing. If you absolutely positively have to get that 485 red out of that color, that's actually the only way you can get it, is DPP. Also, it's DPP if you're shooting RAW, where you can go and change the style, the shooting style that, what am I missing here?
The shooting style of...
In the camera.
Pictures.
Picture style, thank you. You can change the picture style right there in DPP. Literally, I got brain dead for a minute. Lightroom and Photoshop. So, how many of you use Lightroom? And how many of you use Photoshop and Lightroom? And how about DPP? Okay, and actually, for those of you who study histograms, you know, on the back of your camera, you see a kind of a JPEG histogram. You see a different histogram when you get into a RAW process. But in DPP, you see two histograms. You see a RAW histogram, and then you see the real histogram, which I don't want to get into that. It's a different animal. But Lightroom is amazing. It took me years and years and years to get into Lightroom. I went into it kicking and screaming because of color management issues. But it's brilliant. It's brilliant when you come to controlling and getting what we need to get. Everything's already set automatically. You don't have to go set up anything. Where do we need to be keen in resolution? Pixel depth, lens resolution, processing what I call native, and then there's output resolution. So just very quickly, pixel depth, there's 8-bit or 16-bit. That would be JPEG or RAW, if you will. Lens, all I put there was L. Listen, L lens for Canon lenses. And all my lenses are L. And I just came from Wednesday. I went to a company that uses Canon equipment in South Georgia. They're a catalog house, so I went to help them set up their workflow. And we did a test. I took my 5DSR and my 100mm macro lens, and we just did a test with the lens that they have. And they're shooting with a 70D, by the way. And so we looked at the resolution between a highlight and a shadow and the information between there. And with my lens and with their lens, the difference was amazing. So, and assessing one of their needs, of the many needs that they have in that operation. Their camera's fine, we found out, but it's the lens, it's the quality of the lens that just doesn't match the resolution of even that camera. Do you have any points on that at all?
I mean, they're just very crisp lenses. As far as sharpness, quality, you know, even using an L series lens versus any other lens, it just goes well with the camera. It works very fluidly, especially with the full frame cameras. You'll get the most out of your picture.
Well, when we came
your
from
frame.
film, the resolution of the lenses for film, it was more than acceptable. When we switched over to digital and started using the film lenses, that's when it was not acceptable, because the resolution of the cameras were far more than what the resolution of the lens could show. That's not the case anymore. Canon has met that match and exceeded it with their new lenses today. So thank you, Canon, for that. Process native. Process native. Process native. What did I just say? Process native. What does that mean? That means utilize the original size that you got from the camera. There's no reason to upsize or downsize. When you're exporting, let Lightroom or Photoshop do that part for you. When you're working on your images, work on the highest res image you can, which is native from your camera. Does that make sense? And then finally, output size matters when you're printing. There's something I call a forgiveness factor. I used that forgiveness factor in the Michael Jackson job. And I'm here to tell you it works. Don't be afraid of resolution. Use native resolution, and that will take you to the top, even if you have to resample. That's the last thing you would do anyway. But the forgiveness factor with this printer, it's just, it's amazing. Some do, some don't, but there's no reason why a raw processor interface, such as Digital Photo Professional, will show you a JPEG file, and you have controls on it, but you don't have raw controls on it. If you take a if you take a JPEG file into Adobe Camera, which is Photoshop's raw engine processor, you have controls, but it's only going to process what's there in the JPEG. It's not going to bring this data in. And in Lightroom, it's the same thing. Sure, you can use that develop module, which is the same thing as the process in Photoshop in ACR, and it'll do fantastic things to your JPEG files, but it's not bringing in information from out there in the raw world. So, yeah, so if you're shooting JPEG, I'm not suggesting that you stop, but you should be aware of the limitations that might be there when you go through the whole process. And if you take a raw file and a JPEG file through the process, the one thing you want to look at is the histogram, the difference in the histogram. Experience printmaking with Canon Print Studio Pro. If you're a professional portrait photographer, you can create your own templates like this. We'll create one or two here today.
Well, just to maybe clarify, Print Studio Pro is a plugin that you open up with.
For printing.
Yeah, for printing.
It's not for processing.
You don't. Yeah, you wouldn't process it. Yeah, after. It's the final stage.
Oh, no. Can you use it with NEF files?
Net files.
NEF.
NIF?
Nikon.
Oh,
No, but
yeah,
use
you can. I
can?
mean, you know, it's the final stage. So
Oh.
you can open files. You know,
Yes.
JPEGs, TIFFs, RAWs.
Yeah, whatever you
of
have in
any kind.
Lightroom.
Yeah.
And you go to Print Studio Pro, it doesn't care. If
Yeah,
it's
it's not
a
gonna-
JPEG, a NEF file, a CRT2, Sony, whatever.
Yeah.
But I am here to tell you that on Canon's website, I have about a bunch of different videos on how to use Print Studio Pro. Let me just say this, the previous version. But there's only about 5 new things that are not here. The face is a little different, but the techniques and what you'll learn on the website is very excellent information, if I can say so myself. And it's valid and it's current for even this version. but there are some new features. And I also have a series of videos on using the Pixma, oh, that is it. But I also have a series of videos, probably 40, of how to use Canon Digital Photo Professional for those of you that use DPP. And that's the most viewed video series on Canon's website from an Explorer, actually. I'm proud of that. When you go to print from Photoshop or Lightroom or something of that nature, there's two interfaces. First is the Photoshop interface, and then you get to the Canon print driver. And it's saying to go to the Canon print driver. Here's the wonderful thing about a Canon print driver. If you're in Photoshop and you tell it to use Photoshop for color management, and then you go to the print driver is so intelligent, it knows that already, and you don't have to turn off anything. So when you're using Canon products, it just makes it easy. My motto has always been, you make it easy for me, and I'm adapting it. And they've made it easy for me, and I've adapted it. I'm in Lightroom right now, and I just want to go very quickly to Preferences and show you that it's in Preferences where you decide the color space that you want to export out into the world. And ProPhoto RGB is the default setting. You don't have to go set this up, it's already there. That's brilliant. That means as you're working in your RAW files or even JPEG files in Lightroom, it's going to take advantage of the full spectral of chrominance and luminance data that you have to work with prior to exporting. That's a wonderful thing. If you're in Photoshop, you have to go set that up. So I'm opening up a RAW file right now in Photoshop, and on its way to Photoshop, it's going to stop off where? In Adobe Camera Raw, for those of you that use that. And it's actually here is where you set up your, oh, it didn't. Excuse me. Oh, you know, what I'm going to have to do is, that's because I'm working from Lightroom. So now this is Adobe Camera Raw. So when you go into ACR with your RAW file, at the very bottom where you see the kind of blue line here, you click on this, it brings up your color management options for your workflow for your RAW files. And the default setting is sRGB in 8-bit. That's a default setting. And here's where you change it, or if you want to, here's where I change it to ProPhoto RGB and 16-bit. And now all the images that go through directly through Adobe Camera Raw are automatically opened in ProPhoto RGB and 16-bit. Now, having said that, let me close this out. Go back to Lightroom, and let me find another RAW file here. And let's open this up directly into Photoshop. So when this gets into Photoshop, if you look at the bottom right here, let me change this. I'm gonna have to zoom up down here somehow, some way. If you can see what I'm doing here, I'm gonna change this reading to document profile. It comes in at ProPhoto RGB from Lightroom. And of course it comes in at 16-bit as well. So if you're working from Lightroom to Photoshop, you're in good shape. You don't have to do any other settings. So when it comes to workflow, the first thing I do is go in and find my winning images. And with this group of images, there are 125 images. I've already edited these down from about 600 images for this demonstration to about 125 images. But in very quick fashion, what I'll do is type the letter F key. What that does, it gives me a full frame view of the image, my right hand's on the 1 or 2 key, my left hand's on the 1 or 2 key, my right hand's on the right and left arrow key. And I'll go through the images, and if I see one that I like, I'll give it a 1 or 2 star rating by typing the 1 or 2 star key. If you look at the bottom, you see very quickly that it gives a rating. So my objective is to go through and find the images that have a chance for me to get to the second tier of processing. When an image has a second chance of processing, I'll go back through and I'll just read the 2-star rating images. And I'll go back through the same process again, where I'll go through the images, and now I'm looking to rate them 3 or even 4. So any image that has a 2-star rating I'm going to keep it, it's going to be in there, but any image that has a 3-star rating is going to be processed. I'll go to the develop module with those images. If it gets a 4-star rating, chances are I'm going to not only process it, but it's going to have special treatment, whether a third-party filter or to go into Photoshop and that sort of thing. I've already rated all these images, so let's just look at the 4-star images I have. So these are the top images that I've chosen with this particular shoot to go into further processing. Okay, so now let's go to the develop module. Let's go to perhaps this image. I kind of like this image. It kind of reminds me of the Michael Jackson thing. And I have to tell you that what you're looking at on the screen is a good stop and a half brighter than what's on my screen. So in the process, basically what I'll do, let's zoom in over here. In the process I'll go through the basic settings in the develop module, and I'll start right here with highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Sometimes clarity, but never on a person, just scenics, and sometimes a little bit of vibrance. But these 4 controls are my mainstay right here. So as I'm going to now look at the screen instead of my screen, how I would process would be kind of in reverse. I'd take the highlights down, I would open up shadows, but it doesn't really need it on your screen. I would go down to blacks and add some punch to it. And then maybe whites. And that's how I'd process an image, basically. Boom, it's done. On my screen, it's a bit too dark, a bit too contrasty, but it still looks good this way. But to give you an idea, this is what stage 3, that's just my work, that's my means of rating. So each one of us probably already have your methods or means of rating your images. I just find it very quick to do the method I've shared with you. So once I've done that process, I'm ready to print, unless I want to do more of a creative process. At that point, I'll either, let me go to this image for instance. And what I want to do with this image is create a very dramatic look. So I'll take a tool in Lightroom, such as the radial, but wait a minute, before I do that, just a little sip of water. And once again, I'm going to look at the screen and process the image. I'm going to take the highlights down. I don't always take the highlights down, but here I'm going to. Shadow, I'm just checking to see what it does. I'll leave those pretty much deep in the shadow. The whites, I don't use whites too much. Blacks, I love using the black because it adds a lot of punch to the image. And now I'm going to brighten that back up with the shadows. Now I'll take this radial adjustment tool, and with that I'll keep the exposure down, take the highlights down, And that's pretty much what I would do to something like this. Create something a little more dramatic. It wouldn't look quite like that, but something on the order of this. So outside of that, if I go into Photoshop, let me go to a different folder. Oh, this is fun. This is something I photographed last night from a hotel room. And through glass. So when I set the camera down, it was a time exposure. When I set the camera down, this is my camera, I could see the edge of my window sill. So I took a book, I took an ice bucket, and I took my shoe, and I put the shoe on top of the ice bucket, which was at an angle from the book, and put the camera inside the shoe as a tripod. I did a 2-second delay, and then on the back of the camera I used the HDR function. So it shot 3 exposures for me. And I'm not sure if that one is the HDR version or not, because I like shooting the HDR function in the camera, if it's a 5D Mark III or SR or S, because at least I have 3 different exposures to start from. And by the way, this would be a good place to print. As a matter of fact, let me zoom in and see. Before we get too far into the printing, I do want to just go make a print of this while we're waiting. So,
Don't you have to crop it to the size paper you're going to use before you put it in the print module?
that's an excellent question. Don't you have to crop it to the size you're going to print it? And the answer is no, because I try to stay native with everything. It's not a bad idea to crop it, but there's a cropping feature when you get into the Print Studio Pro interface. So if you want to crop it to a specific size, you can crop it right there.
What about Lightroom? That's where you do it.
Oh, you can do it in Lightroom too. You can either way.
You're saying you don't?
No, and I'm going to demonstrate in a little bit. If you bring images into Lightroom, a bunch of them, and you want to crop them to a certain size, you can actually do that during that print session. But it's perfectly okay to crop them in Lightroom because Lightroom is a parametric processor. It's not really going to crop it. You can always go back to the original, not to mention you have a history. But if you look at the directory here, I've gone to File, Plug in Extras, and now that's where Canon Print Studio Pro is. File, Plug in Extras, and Canon Print Studio Pro. And look what I'm going to do. I'm going to click Print. When you click Print, it tells you what you've got going on here, and tell it OK. And then you get to the Canon Print driver. And all you do is click Print. There's nothing to set up here. The default setting is what you use.
So you don't need to do even a soft proof?
I've got soft proof turned on. And the reason I went in and did the printing here is to show you how easy it is, once you get everything set up, it is to print. It's that easy, it's that quick, it's that fast. And what I'm going to do next is go back out and show you some more details here. Because we do want to, you do want to set up specific things in your print. And the wonderful thing is this version of Print Studio Pro does have a soft proof feature. Okay, so I'm going to go to File, Plug in Extras, and then Canon Print Studio Pro. Now I'll hold this up for you for a moment. Are we good with that? Can I let go now?
Also, just to point out that you see he has all these images selected. They're all going to open up in Print Studio Pro.
I was going to surprise him with that.
Oh,
but
sorry.
No, that's good. But he's right. So I've selected, what, 31 images? And if you're in Photoshop and you had 5 images open, it would bring those 5 images automatically into Print Studio Pro. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to kind of give you an indication of the 1, 2, 3, 4 panels, not panels, but areas that are in Print Studio Pro. What's wonderful about this? So you talk about printing from Lightroom. You go to the Lightroom print module. It's got some fantastic features there, and it's good. But this is proprietary to Canon printers, and it's designed to maximize everything about printing. Where from Lightroom print module or Photoshop, once you do the work there, you go to the Canon's print driver, and any changes are finally made there. Here, everything's done right in the interface of Print Studio Pro. As I mentioned earlier, I've never printed in this printer, and just to see these things come off looking this good, I'm so excited. Yes, sir. Your assessment, understanding, and corrections are absolutely correct, right on target. But I don't remember the last time I had to change my brightness settings in the Canon export module except for one type of paper. So it all depends. Look how beautiful that came out. My prints are too dark syndrome depends on 2 things: the paper type, the media type, and the profile that you're using. And if you have to tell it to brighten up 10%, save that as a setting, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've had to do that with certain paper types, and other paper types I don't have to. But look at the screen, if you will, and focus in what I'm going to show you. On the left side, it might be hard to see, there's a little twirl out button right here, and it brings out this panel. This panel is just 2 things. It's print information, the name of your file, the size the file would be at a certain resolution, and the color space it's in. Hello, what are you doing in Adobe RGB? I don't know. And then there's print settings information. Now, everything here is nothing you can do about it. It's just what's there. So this is good information to know. It's good information to check. But I'm going to tuck this away because I don't need that space. At the very bottom, there's another button that you can click. And this brings up all the thumbnails. Well, there we go. This is all the thumbnails you see at the bottom that I've selected to come into Print Studio Pro. You also see a series of tools over here, such as the cropping tool mentioned a minute ago, zoom tool, rotation tools. If I want to just change pages, I can use this to go to the end, and depending on how I've got my print set up. And then there's the print button over here. I'm going to tuck this away. No, I'm not. I'll just leave that set up. And on the right side of the panel, this is where all the heavy-duty stuff comes in. You have My Settings at the very top. And My Settings is a collection of setups that you created. It could be different size prints, different size paper, different profiles, different looks. Whatever matrix, if you will, that you've established for your printing, you save those, and they're always available for you to click on to apply that to your new settings. So let's take a look at all that. To create My Settings, there's 3 areas here that you want to look at: print settings, layout, and correction. In print settings, there's 2 things here. Print settings again, and color management. But the most important thing here, of course, we're going to choose this printer. The most important thing right here is the media type. Choosing the type of paper that you're printing on tells the printer some important features, such as how much ink to lay down on the paper. It might use more ink for a matte paper in certain areas, that sort of thing. The paper size, and we're printing on 17 by 22, which is C, and we're using a rear tray here. We also have the option for manual feed. Where does manual feed go in on this printer?
It's in the back right
You
here.
open up the back.
So it's for those fine art papers, those heavyweight fine
Okay.
art medias, basically.
And then the print quality, I've got it set to standard. So in my work, I always have it set to highest quality because I'm worth it. It takes a little bit longer to print, but my images look better. So when you use the ICC profile, you then have the ability to choose a profile. And if you're using Canon printers, you can just choose auto. And what auto will do, it'll look at how you've got your media type set, and it will use a profile that it's previously installed into your system and use that for you automatically. Or you can go choose the profile right here also. So I'm going to go back to the custom profile that I was using. These are all the profiles in my system.
Wow.
There we go. And here's where this is where the color matching method is that we talked about earlier. Relative colorimetric or perceptual. I've had it set on perceptual. Now let's switch it over to relative colorimetric. And the button to enable soft proofing. So if you enable soft proofing, I want to show you something interesting. And that would be, let's just simply change the profile. Did you see the difference there?
Yes.
Yep.
Change it to a different profile. So
That's all paper color, correct?
I beg your pardon?
That's mimicking the paper color, which is going to change.
That is correct, yes. So that would be canvas profile. It's almost hard to trick it, but this is one area that you can actually trick it. If we go to lightweight, so I would either be on auto or using a custom profile or choosing the supplied profile, always. But now you have an idea if you need to make any corrections.
Can you switch the rendering intent so we can see the difference?
Switch the what, please?
The rendering intent.
Oh, the rendering intent, you probably won't see much difference at all on this.
Just in the shadow,
Oh, yeah.
just in the reflection on the floor.
Oh, okay, good. Oh, you're looking at a much brighter image than I am up here.
I can see it.
Yeah.
I can usually see it on my screen, but with all these bright lights hitting my face, I'm visually impaired. And I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
Could you go over again how the automatic setting works?
The automatic is tied into this right here, your media type. Whatever media type you've chosen that you're going to print to. Right now we're printing to the Pro Luster paper. If I choose auto, it says, oh, you're using Pro Luster paper. I'm choosing the Pro Luster paper profile for you automatically. So your biggest concern is to choose the proper paper type here, media type, and it will choose the profile, printer profile for you when you're using ICC profiles.
Using just Canon papers?
Yes, or any paper. When you use a third-party paper, on their website or on their information
Website,
sheet,
yeah.
it will tell you what media type to use for their paper. So you can use that and still use auto. You see my face crumbling up there a little bit? But the other thing you can also do, from their website, you can download their profile for this printer and their paper type. And then there you would want to choose, you wouldn't want to use auto then. You want to choose their profile for this printer and the paper. And that works wonderfully too. So when I looked at this image by surprise, it told me that I was going from Adobe RGB. I don't know where that came from because I don't use Adobe RGB. So this image is being funneled into Adobe RGB before it gets to the print driver. That's okay. It came from here. I don't care if it goes to sRGB. It's going to look the same. But in order for color, the science of color management to work, it has to go from one color space into the other color space. It just can't come from the abyss and end up.
So the wide gamut does not get, it doesn't go in wide gamut to the new printer, it goes to
Yes, well,
RGB or ProPhoto.
it should go from wide gamut. So I print from ProPhoto RGB. Why this image went to Adobe, that is something I just saw for the first time myself.
Can you change it?
I'm sure you can, but because I haven't done that, I don't know how to answer that.
You can't do it in Print Studio Pro.
You can't do anything about it, you said?
Yeah, you'd have to change it in Lightroom or Photoshop.
Well, from Lightroom, it automatically is in
Well, yeah,
ProPhoto.
yeah.
So I'll have to investigate that one.
With the Chroma Optimizer option, if I toggled between the 1000 or the 1, and then I decided to print from a 100 and I switched the printer, it would take away the option to apply the Chroma Optimizer. So the Print Studio Pro software will change based on the printer you're using. For the most part, it'll work the same between the 110 and 1000. The 100 is just the exception.
Okay, so let's go finish your question here. I'm going to switch this over to black and white. And there's a partner to this. We hadn't gotten over to that yet, but I'm going to go over to correction. And in correction, you have strength right here. You have soft tone, all the way up to strong hard tone.
Okay.
So you have those options working right here. And also, since you asked before, well, no, I haven't got there yet. Let me get to the layout after that. So, but the corrections is another area that's pretty strong in the workflow here.
And that's on the 100 as well?
It's in this, well, yes,
Well, it's in Print Studio Pro.
it's in Print Studio Pro. So it would be for the 100 also. The menu might change just a little bit, but the options are there. Go, I'm switching this back to color. And now let's go to the second tab, which is called Layout. And here are some presets from Canon that would be borderless, or bordered as you just saw, or we can use 2-up borderless, or 2-up bordered, 4-up the same way, all the way down to even index. So this is 20 images per page. And I've got 31 images open, so the second page would just print those images on the size paper that we're using. So let's do this. Let's go back to borderless, or bordered 2. And now there's something here called, if you click on the tab Layout, it opens up all these other features here. So what the size is right now, they're 9 by 15s. If you look at the cell size, and let's say I wanted 8 by 10s. So if I type in 8 by 10, then I've got 8 by 10s. There's actually enough room on this size paper where I could do 4 8 by 10s. You can change your margins right up here. If you change your margins, you need to go back and type your 8 by 10 back in. So all of the presets I've made has been on 13 by 19 paper. So I haven't made any presets for I didn't have a chance to make any presets for this. But the ability to make a series of different presets. You start out with one of the Canon presets, and then go in and change all the settings from there. Down here you can change how many rows and columns you have. Let's take this to, say, 5x7. And now we can change how many rows and grids we have. And again, I'm kind of digging a little hole for myself in that because I wasn't prepared for this size paper. But this is where you customize your layout. So I have to put a little more work into it. This is beyond, yeah. And you know, this is also kind of the first version for this printer. And I can assure you that new versions will be coming out. I don't know what the features were. I wish I could request some features for it, but it's only going to get better and better and better. In corrections, you have brightness, your contrast, and all the CMYK or RGB CMY adjustments here. They're easy to do. In this version, you even have a curve adjustment you can use, which is pretty fantastic. And you know, knock on wood, these images I'm working on, they haven't needed any kind of color correction. I consider these controls more of a creative control. Why? Because we color balance our images, white balance, we get good exposures, right? None of us make mistakes on that anymore, do we?
Never.
Never. So I can come in here without making any changes. It's all about consistency. And if you have something, it's all about what too?
You're talking to perfect students. All 4.0.
There you go. So, but here's a feature that's very interesting. It's called print pattern. When you go to print pattern, let me get a different image up for this. And just select an image here. Now let's go to print pattern. And this does what we call a ring around. And I can only zoom my screen up, but the center is 0, 0, 0. This is the image we have. And when we print this image out, it'll print with a ring around from the magenta, the cyan, the yellow. It'll give it all the different things. There's also a setting, oh good, thank you. So here's the ring around we printed just right before you walked in today. And if you look at the center image, that's the one with no correction. And as you inspect this, if you find one of these is more suitable for your workflow, just circle that. And it tells you the correction. So if I wanted this one, I would go -5 cyan, +10 magenta, and -5 yellow. And once I have that set up, then I'm in the centered part that I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, did I print out a contrast one also? There's also one for light, brightness, and contrast. So you can hone in on the exact look.
Why don't you print one out now?
I could do that. And let's do that because that's a great idea. Thank you. So
Let's do 1319.
right here you can choose the color or the brightness contrast. When you choose brightness contrast, I'm going to tell it to use a large image instead of the small ones and give me a large amount of change. And let's go back to medium on this. And we're just going to click print.
It's
Print.
1319.
Right.
So it's bigger.
So this, actually it's set for paper A4 size, which we don't have in the printer. But it's going to print it down to an A4 size, even on the paper that we're using here. So if you had A4 size, you might want to put that in the printer. But I want to see what it looks like on this particular paper. So let's go ahead and send that to the printer. When that comes back, if there are changes, you make the changes right here. Brightness, color balance, contrast. I'm just going to tell this OK or actually cancel here. Here.
You know what I'm wondering, I mean, if I'm gonna print through Print Studio Pro, I will have already edited I've done my editing already in Lightroom.
That's okay.
So why would I be using this?
I love that question. Why would you be using these correction features, if you've already made your corrections? And the answer is you wouldn't be. However, what I see here is a fantastic creative use. You're playing around with something, you've come up with a special look that's truly yours that you've created here. The joy about doing all of this is you save those settings to My Settings. And instead of going through all of this again, you have access to whatever creative setups you've made before. Just make,
You have that capability though, Lightroom to do that. You can decide if that picture's right for you, but you don't have the capability in Lightroom to see that whole range and that's a ton of work.
No.
no, you don't. And here's another joy of this. If you one day are working from Photoshop instead of Lightroom, you have this same interface with the same presets, or DPP. So the workflow that you develop in Print Studio Pro goes right back to where I started. You just go to Print Studio Pro, click open up your image, select your layout that you preset, and click print. And it's that simple. Okay, so when it comes to resolution, 240 is a good standard resolution for inkjet printing, period. Unless you get up to a 44-inch printer, then 150 is adequate for one.
I have a Pixma Pro 1, and so the maximum
Yeah.
is 13 by 19.
240 is more than adequate. If you're using 300, that's great. There's, in the test I've done, I haven't seen a fall-off point from one resolution to another. And the test I've made with the Michael Jackson job, for instance, where I took a 58 megabyte file and made a, I don't remember the size, a 300 megabyte file from it, 11 feet tall, so much wide at, I think I put that at 96 resolution. The prints look fantastic.
Yeah, but the larger the paper, the smaller the number for the resolution.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so is there like a formula I could use?
There's a formula you can find online. I don't use that formula because I use native resolution.
So what does that mean then? I thought native resolution for Canon was 300, and for Epson it was 360. And so what is the native resolution for Canon?
Well, the native resolution, when it comes to pixels per inch, it's whatever your camera shoots. And it could be 72 pixels per inch, or 240, or whatever. But that's native resolution. When it comes to the printer resolution, it's more like, what is it, 2,800?
2400 by 4800.
2,400 by 4,800 dots per inch. I use what is known as the forgiveness factor. So understand, I stopped shooting film back in the mid-90s and started digital. And it was during that period of time where I would zoom Photoshop into 1600 to 1 ratio to do pixel retouching. I remember shooting a catalog and waking up at night, in the middle of the night, running down to the studio, opening a file just to retouch 2 or 3 pixels that I knew I missed. And I went back and I was able to sleep that night. Little did I know the forgiveness factor then. But there's a point where, as Steve said, you can't disseminate the difference at all. 1600 to 1, that's crazy, that's silly. No printer would ever pick up that much data from these files. So what happens when the ink hits paper, it spreads out. It's called dot gain. And the difference between this printer and the previous printers is the amount of the tightness of the ink. What am I trying to say here? Or-
No,
it's a new technology. That
it's
Canon
the
has
ink
come
is it's a denser combination of ink together. So like whereas like traditionally it would have been like this, your ink's laying much closer together, so you have a much larger gamut of color that shows on the print. Again, a unified shine as well, so there's no spots. Not that you would see that anyways in the older prints, but it's just denser. It's just closer together. Yeah, it's more accurate. It's more precise in where it's being laid is really what it is, and it also lays on top of the paper, especially fine art medias.
You would need to view it very closely to see the difference. It's just a finer print quality. So I understand your concern, ma'am, but I'm here to tell you that if you want to do a test yourself, do one at 150, 240, 300, and 360, and see if you can tell a difference from your test visually. You might be able to see it under a viewer, but just do that test, and that will help you learn what I call the forgiveness factor. If I'm going to print 40 by 60, I will just sample it up in Photoshop with nothing special. 150 resolution for large prints. And I was recording a series of educational videos for the Professional Photographers of America. We did some processing and we printed on the 8300 printer. So we did this and we sent the file, converted it, and sent it all native resolution. I thought I was printing a 30 by 40 inch image, but in the haste of getting through and being on camera and nervous and all that stuff, I printed a 40 by 70 inch image. And it was beautiful. So, you know, it's just there. What's going to happen is, one more thing, there's something called viewing distance. So if you see an image and it's beautiful and you walk up to it like this and you see all the pixelization, it's like, oh, that's terrible. You're viewing too close. And this option right here, printer manages color, no. You want Photoshop to manage the color. That brings up the ability to choose a profile for that printer that you've chosen up here. And let me choose an erroneous printer, like my Pro one. Photoshop manages color, and I'm choosing some crazy profile, I don't care right now, and I'm going to send this to next. When I click print, now it goes to the printer driver, and this is Canon's interface. So if you go to color matching, it's turned off. You can't do anything. This is what I'm telling you, that because Photoshop's managing the color, the Canon print driver automatically turns off its ability to do anything. So now you just print. You don't be concerned about the settings in here. When you're looking at the JPEG histogram on the back of the camera, you're looking for the toe of the mountain. Okay? You know what I'm talking about. You have a good toe of the mountain on the shadow highlight side. Your raw histogram is going to be much better than that. So you know you've got your information. Shooting not too long ago, my assistant said, "Oh, this looks terrible." And I said, "But the histogram looks perfect." And that's all that mattered at that point. We've got it. We've got it in there. Because I shoot flat, process contrast. That's my motto.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.